Exactly 79 years ago to the day this episode is released, the USA changed the course not just of World War II, but of global history by using nuclear weapons. The bombs that hit Hiroshima and 3 days later Nagasaki killed an estimated 200,000 people and swiftly prompted Japan's surrender. But how did it get to this? What were Japan and America even doing in a war triggered by Nazi Germany? And when there were so many other courses of action, why did the USA drop atomic bombs on Japan? Welcome to America, a history podcast. I'm Liam Heffernan, and every week we answer a different question to understand the people, the places, and the events that make the USA what it is today. To discuss this, I am joined by Sherzod Muminov, an Associate Professor of Japanese History at the University of East Anglia. He researches the history of 20th century Japan within the larger contexts of imperialism, World War II, the Cold War, and other domestic and international entanglements. And he also has tons of published work, which we will link you to in the show notes. Hello, Sherzod.
Hello, Liam.
Thank you so much for joining me on this podcast, and I hope I didn't mispronounce your name horrendously.
No, you pronounce it perfectly, and thank you for the invitation. This is a really interesting podcast, and I'm very pleased and very excited to be chatting with you today.
Yeah, I'm really delighted to have you on the show, and this topic particularly is one that I think everyone knows about, but it's become particularly higher profile in the last year because of Oppenheimer, which went on to win Oscars, and it just kind of put it back on the map. So let's talk about that, and also just to try and understand that American-Japanese relationship just a little bit more. So let's begin by just trying to understand how these two countries even came to be at war with one another. Could you give us a bit of backstory as to sort of how it got to that?
Certainly. The answer depends on how far you're willing to go back in historic terms, because we can go back as far as late 19th century to trace the evolution of the rivalry and of conflict and confrontation between the United States and Japan. We have to mention, of course, the United States played a very important role in bringing Japan into the international system in mid-19th century. In 1850s, American famous Commodore Matthew Perry opened, so to say, this is the term that is used often in literature, that opened Japan to the world, which is not strictly true, but brought Japan into this new international system as a new country, because for 250 years before that, Japan had been a relatively secluded, semi-feudal nation. And I think tensions, you can say, really started to come to the fore at the turn of the 20th century, when Japan announced itself as a dominant power in East Asia and, importantly, in the Pacific. Because in 1895, Japan defeated Qing China and a decade later Tsarist Russia, through that becoming the most powerful nation in the Pacific, which obviously, you can't really predict everything in history looking from that vantage point. But if, for example, that signaled Japan becoming a significant and probably the most powerful nation in East Asia and in the Pacific, that would lead it to a collision, put it on a collision course with the US, which famously even Lenin in 1916 predicted that this competition for China, competition for the Pacific intensifies, and eventually there will be a conflict between America and Japan. So this is kind of my very vague opening introduction to everything that went before the 1930s, if you like. So the rivalry was there, obviously, within the greater context of imperialism, greater context of competition for influence in China. United States and Japan were not the only powers that were in that competition. Britain was really, probably up until the 1920s, the most important colonial empire in the world, until even later, actually. But of course, both the US and Japan were relative newcomers compared to the European empires, and they were both trying to challenge in their own way, for their own interest, the status quo. And because they were both empires' interests were concentrated around the Pacific. Obviously, for the U.S., you also have the Atlantic side, but for Japan, Pacific was the main theater. It would probably lead them to collide sooner or later, or maybe even not collide, maybe in the military sense, but to confront one another and to be rivals with one another.
Yeah, and I guess my biggest sort of question mark over all of this is, why did America care so much what Japan were doing? You know, they have the Pacific, which sort of separates them, and, you know, arguably, from what I understand, there was some sort of strategic kind of military benefits to, you know, being well positioned in the Pacific. I mean, that's another conversation with Hawaii, etc. But other than that, like, why did America care?
I think it's a fundamental question of foreign policy and international politics. When a nation views an area, or say as strategically or economically important for its own interests, then any other nation or any other power that questions that or challenges that will automatically be considered a rival about whom you have to care. I mean, if you can't not care if for example, you have ambitions, say, or you have national interests, or you have business interests. I think in this case, where the name of the game was most of the time informal imperialism that wasn't done through the state institutions or through state officials, but was actually geared towards protecting business interests, primarily protecting trade routes, and then of course strategic importance was also there, strategic and military, say, in national defense and other terms. And because the United States, due to its geographic position, and increasingly starting from the 19th century and the beginning of the 20th century, its economic importance, its growing, expanding economic importance, because by the end of the First World War, which was devastating for the traditional European old world empires, the United States, just as it was, of course, just as it would be at the end of the Second World War, the United States was, even already at the end of the First World War, one of the most powerful empires, although that wasn't really as conspicuous as it later became. So why did the United States care? They cared because Japan was challenging any European empire or Euro-American, if you like, empires in East Asia. Japan was doing this for its own national interest. Japan had defeated very impressively Imperial Russia, and Japan saw itself over the 20 years or so of the first 20 years of the 20th century as this new voice, if you like, a new player that can promise not only to the big empires with which it was cooperating at the time. It wasn't all conflict. Things then went bad. That it was promising a new deal for Asia itself as an Asian power, as the first non-white power. And for us, it might sound a bit, not very edifying to mention race in every issue, but at the time, race was very important. This was the time when yellow peril was used widely, racist slurs were widely used, and race was a very important prism through which even international politics was viewed. So at the time, to be of the first non-white empire, to have defeated a white European empire, was a source of great pride for Japan. Also, source of great prestige among the so-called colored nations or colonized nations, because Japan won a lot of political and international clout through its victory over Russia. So that kind of prestige, that kind of up-and-coming power that is going to challenge not only Britain, but also the US, in China, but also in the Pacific, was bound to create attention, at the very least, concern, also as Japan's strength actually grew in the region.
And we'll get on to the events around Pearl Harbor in a moment, because that very much was sort of the trigger point that brought the two countries into World War II. But you touched on race, and how that can be a real driving force behind political behaviour as well. And I'm really keen to understand how much of a factor race and indeed racism was in fueling that tension between America and Japan, and ultimately making it any sort of diplomatic resolution completely impossible once Pearl Harbor happened.
I think race did play a big part in all of that. I did mention that race was a big factor in international politics and in domestic politics. Unfortunately, 100 years on, race and immigration actually remain to be big issues in most of the countries in the West. But exactly 100 years ago, in 1924, race became a big issue between Japan and the United States, because in that year, US Congress passed immigration laws, which did not mention Japan specifically, but which practically banned any immigration from Japan to the United States. Obviously, it wasn't a fresh issue in 1924, because 5 years prior to that, Japan's proposal at the Paris Peace Conference to introduce a racial non-discrimination clause to the Covenant of the League of Nations was rejected, practically shot down by the United States and Britain, which hurt Japan very badly, or say hurt Japan's pride very badly, because Britain was officially closest ally to Japan at the time. So obviously, from the British perspective, the colonies was a big consideration in not supporting that kind of a proposal. It was a harmless proposal. It really hoped to end discrimination in international forums by the Japanese side. And obviously Japan was also playing a very smart game in trying to portray themselves as speaking for all the non-white peoples of the world. So with the 1924 immigration law, the nationalists and ultra-nationalist conservative people in Japan, but also people not really interested in politics, people who didn't really normally think about the United States on a daily basis, became very angry. And people went on protests. People went on, people carried big slogans saying that you have to apologize, you have insulted our imperial pride. So from then on, obviously on the west coast of the United States, Japanese and Chinese and other Asian immigration had been happening for decades by that time. And it's important to note that from the Japanese national viewpoint, official viewpoint, immigration wasn't simply something that you tolerated or that you basically just, let happen. The Japanese elite and the Japanese leadership viewed immigration as an opportunity to plant the seeds of Japanese nation in various parts of the world. And so there was encouragement to emigrate, to go to the Americas, to Brazil, for example, to Peru, to the United States and Mexico. So when that limitation came into force, this was seen as a source of indignation for the Japanese, as if this was proof that despite all the high sounding talk at the Paris Peace Conference of democracy and self-determination that the American president Woodrow Wilson was conveying to the world as the new world order, that the white people, or at least this was the view in Japan among the nationalists, that the white empires will still remain racist, and however much progress we demonstrate, however much cooperation we offer to these powers, they will never see as equal. So that kind of thinking obviously contributes to what happens radicalization in the later in the decade after that, in the 30s in Japan.
And it feels very much at this point like that it's kind of it's sort of, it takes two to tango, as they say, and sort of America and Japan both will kind of have had very conflicting viewpoints, and that kind of contributed and sort of snowballed into what became an outright conflict in World War II. So let's talk about that. So Pearl Harbor was, where did that come from? Because I think Western sort of education kind of pictures it as if, Americans were doing their thing. They were based in Hawaii, and then the Japanese came along and, attacked. Was it really that unprovoked?
It wasn't completely unprovoked. Obviously, it was a very reckless decision. And one thing I would really like to do is to emphasize how complex the process was that led to Pearl Harbor. So it wasn't that suddenly the Japanese decide, oh, let's go to war against America because they hate us and we hate them. No, obviously it was a long process of diplomacy that ultimately, unfortunately for the world, for America and for Japan, failed. It was the backdrop in America might have been, as you portrayed quite accurately, that America was not really seeking war with Japan, that America was doing its thing, as you said. Although, again, there is some complexity there too, because there were people who were advocating military conflict with Japan years before Pearl Harbor, or at least anticipating that some kind of a conflict will have to take place if America hopes to defend its interests in China, in Asia, and in the Pacific. But on the Japanese side, I think a lot of the decisions that happened in the run-up to the Pearl Harbor actually can be traced back to some of the things that are not strictly related to the United States initially. I can highlight maybe the importance of Japan's war in China, which we call Second Sino-Japanese War, which starts in July 1937, which in itself was a war that Japan, basically, you can say, with some risk of exaggeration or with some risk of oversimplification, you can say that Japan sleepwalked into that war. That certain factions in the Japanese military were overly zealous in trying to teach a lesson to China, trying to punish China for decades of anti-Japanese sentiment, for decades of not budging to Japanese demands, which, if you look from the Chinese perspective, it's ridiculous. China had been harassed, if I use that word, by foreign empires for decades by that time. There was a lot of anti-Japanese sentiment. The anti-Japanese sentiment was so strong that even sworn enemies like Chiang Kai-shek of the KMT, of the Chinese Nationalist Party, and Mao Zedong, who was the leader of the Chinese Communists, they set aside their differences when the Japanese invaded China in 1937 to form a united front. So the Japanese military plans to teach a quick lesson, to punish the Chinese, to make them accept some of their demands, that the demands had been in place for more than 20 years, that the Chinese had been resisting, that the Chinese had been unwilling to compromise on. That war becomes a quagmire for the Japanese. The Japanese become bogged down in that war. And again, at the risk of oversimplification, what happens later and the collision course that leads to Pearl Harbor actually goes back to Japan's inability to win a decisive war in China, despite the horrible atrocities committed by the Japanese military in Nanjing and in other parts of China in trying to break down the resistance of the Chinese. And subsequently, the Japanese attempt to seek a breakthrough, to seek a situation that would work in their favor, but also to seek new sources of resources, because the war was an incredible drain on Japanese resources, both human resources, but of course we're talking about an expensive war where you need fuel, you need all kinds of other material. So the confrontation intensifies with the United States, and I'm not talking about military confrontation yet. In 1940, when Japan signs a tripartite pact in September with the Nazi Germany and Italy. And again, I have to emphasize here that it was not a unanimous and a very easy decision for the Japanese to join. These days, we kind of tend to group those fascist powers together. If you look at what people talk in the West about that. However, there was never a clear and unanimous compromise on so many of the issues, including the Pearl Harbor, among the Japanese leadership. By this time, the Japanese military was playing an oversized role in government. The Japanese military was dictating Japanese diplomacy despite the resistance from the Japanese diplomats. So, and even within the military, there were, of course, significant divisions, as the whole decade of the 1930s in Japan demonstrates. So, in 1940, another big development was Japan's decision to occupy parts of Indochina, obviously taking advantage of the fall of France in 1940, in the same year, where French Indochina is now basically out of French hands, France itself being overrun by Germans, which the Japanese, of course, use to seek a breakthrough, which is not welcomed by the United States. And from that moment on, you can actually talk about active economic warfare on the United States side. However, it once again needs to be emphasized that the United States is not, even in 1940, even as it becomes clearer that diplomatic solution is very difficult, that the Japanese are not willing to accept some of the terms that the Americans are putting forward for a peaceful solution, even then the United States is not completely cutting Japan off from all these oil and other exports, which were vital for the Japanese war effort. And we can talk why the US wasn't doing that, but I guess my answer is already quite long.
Yeah, that's an interesting one, actually, particularly as, you know, there was a conflict between them. You'd think that would be the first thing they would do, would just be to cut off any exports. But that's certainly interesting. I do wonder, you know, you've given a lot of context around, you know, Japan's activities, and there was a lot of things happening that seemed to contribute to their ultimate decision to bomb Pearl Harbor that were actually not directly related to what was happening in Europe during World War II. So do you think Pearl Harbor would have happened anyway, or was World War II just kind of the handy catalyst to give them an excuse, really, I guess?
Obviously, we tend in our work, and also in our work with students, just by virtue of being in Britain, I guess, or by virtue of being in Europe, we tend to look at the Second World War from the European perspective. And what happened also, the Cold War is still a very Europe-centered or West-centered or America-centered field. And that can sometimes be detrimental in trying to understand what's going on with Japan. I think this is probably one of the instances, and I really like your question, Liam, here, where you can clearly see that Japan would one day still go to war with the United States, considering what I just outlined in my previous answer, considering its own situation. Obviously, I'm not blaming the United States for that. One way to look at it is Japan had painted itself into a corner from which it really couldn't see any way out. And hence, you could probably look at the recklessness of the attack on Pearl Harbor, and you will be justified in thinking, what on earth are these people thinking? This is an economy that is several times larger than the Japanese economy. This is a navy that is larger than the Japanese navy. In every respect, Japan cannot hope to win in a conflict against the United States. But if you look at the context, and if you look at the fact that Japan simply had gone too far in its effort to gain a foothold in China, to secure what it had won by that time, say, for example, the puppet kingdom of Manchukuo, which was nominally an independent state but was practically run by Japan. And Japan had colonies that had been formally annexed into Japan proper, Taiwan and Korea. So to secure that, to justify both to the domestic population, but also to the emperor, that all the sacrifices of the past years, all the strife of the war and efforts of the military that were not for nothing, that adds, of course, to the determination to really take that reckless step into the unknown. But obviously, strategically thinking, they didn't hope, even the people who devised the Pearl Harbor Operation Hawaii, as it was initially called. It was devised by the famous Admiral Yamamoto Isoroku, about whom films are made. He himself was deeply opposed to war with the United States, but in his role as a naval strategist, he had to obviously come up with a plan.
I think, before we address the atomic bomb specifically, I think it was really important to just get a bit of context as to some of the events and the relationship sort of pre-World War II that kind of led to that. So that's super helpful, I think, in just sort of framing what ultimately led to the atomic bomb drop. So let's talk about the bomb. So
okay.
You already mentioned Japan were outmatched and outnumbered by the American military. So what possible justification was there by America to drop the atomic bomb when they could have outpowered them just in direct conflict?
Okay, it's a very complex question again. So I think we have to, again, mention Pearl Harbor here. Because Pearl Harbor was not only a reckless attack from the Japanese viewpoint, not only was it a kind of a last resort, desperate, well-planned, relatively well executed, although it could have been, from a strategic viewpoint, it could have been done better, and historians have noted this. It was still a reckless attack. And it brought the United States not only into the Pacific theater, but also just in general into the Second World War. Because the day after Pearl Harbor, Germany also announces war against the United States, not just Japan. So this was a momentous event in the sense that it really came after months and months of talking between the Japanese and the Americans. And it wasn't clear. And I think the surprise nature of the Pearl Harbor attack is partly the reason for its devastation, because as the famous book memoir says, the title of the memoir, "At dawn we slept." The Americans were sleeping. All of America was completely caught by surprise, and that element of surprise and the blatant nature of the attack, the fact that Japan struck America first and struck quite heavily. In relative terms, 3,000 3,000 plus American casualties, a few warships, not much damage in the sense that strategically, all the big aircraft carriers had been at sea at the time, and the Japanese also, of course, knew this because they had very fresh intelligence even on the day of the attack. But it also should be noted that up until the 1st of December, and we're talking 7th of December, of the day of the attack, the Japanese really tried and waited for a diplomatic solution. So reckless as it was, people didn't give up on diplomacy until the very last few days. So the bomb itself, if we then go almost 4 years from Pearl Harbor to 1945, America is waging 2 wars here. The second of those wars actually comes into the picture much later, in the last months of the war. The first war, obviously, is this very brutal and very savage, if you like, war in the Pacific. And John Dower, the famous historian of Japan, has written a book called War Without Mercy. And I think that title conveys the nature of that war perfectly. And it was a war that was fought along race lines once again. So there was a lot of hatred which was cultivated. One episode that comes from that book, which I always mention to my students, is a picture in the Life magazine, which was the most popular photo magazine in the US at the time, perhaps in the world, was a picture of the skull of a Japanese soldier that an American soldier sent to his girlfriend in the US as a memento, as a present. So, and it was seen, not only was it seen as normal, but also Life actually took a picture of this young woman with this skull and published it. So you can judge the amount of hatred, the amount of all wars actually are built on dehumanization of the enemy, but all of that had been building up. Obviously the memory of the Pearl Harbor was there, which I guess what I'm trying to lead you to is made the decision more palatable, made the decision to use this absolutely horrific weapon, the unprecedented weapon that humanity hadn't seen before, didn't know, could predict how bad it would be, but didn't know. And of course there was moral question to be made. The American president, Harry Truman, at the time, the day he made the decision, the day he actually gave the order to use the bomb against Japan, July 25th, 1945, in his diary entry, he wrote that this would be an absolutely horrific thing to do, even as he actually authorized the use of the weapon. And he is, I think, grappling with this, with the enormity of the decision, that thousands, tens of thousands of civilians will die. And the bomb was developed specifically to do as much damage to civilian life and infrastructure as possible. And in a way to kind of, to absolve, maybe not absolve, to maybe kind of make that pill less bitter. In that diary entry, Harry Truman also writes that we will use only military targets, that we will not drop it on non-military targets. So, yeah, I mean, you could feel free to follow up with other questions, but it's a massive decision.
So there's an obvious question here around morality, because as you pointed out, Harry Truman himself was struggling with that even at the point that he was ordering the bomb. And when we sort of contextualize this in sort of the present day, you know, we see what's happening between Russia and Ukraine, we see what's happening in the sort of the Gaza war, and comparatively to the atomic bomb, which killed, you know, around the sort of 200,000 people, you know, these wars today, you know, bombs are being dropped that are killing civilians in sort of the tens or the hundreds at a time. And that's being seen with such scorn by the rest of the world. So Truman knew it was wrong. Truman knew there would be monumental civilian casualties here. Surely there's no justification, even in war, to do something like that.
Absolutely. At the same time, there were several reasons why the Americans were very keen to use this weapon in the Second World War. One of those was this reluctance to come into direct contact. I mean, this is the term that they use in their correspondence, in the archives, as if America hadn't been in direct contact with the Japanese in the Pacific War for the preceding 4 years. But that's what they want. But that's what they mean by to obviate, to basically avoid landing troops on Japan proper. Because the Americans, by that time, had been quite tired of the war. So nobody predicted the war to go on for so long. And as the decision to use the bomb was made in July, it wasn't clear. It wasn't entirely clear, especially to the general public, although strategic documents show that the Americans did expect Japan to surrender sooner than later, that the war could drag on until 1946, that despite the Germans being defeated 3 months prior to Japan, that Japan could become this kind of rogue power that will really kind of fight on. And there were voices coming out of Japan, of radical officers who were talking about fighting to the last drop of blood, to the last Japanese person. And it was primarily, from the American president's viewpoint, an attempt to try and prevent any further American casualties, especially to prevent that kind of street-to-street fighting that would have to happen if Japan didn't surrender and the Americans actually had to invade the home islands and not just bomb the home islands from distance. Another consideration, the big consideration, I mentioned like 2 wars, and the second war was, of course, the beginning of the Cold War. We can talk until the cows come home when the Cold War started, which we won't do. It's a completely different topic. But already at the time, in 1945, the rivalry between the two, what would become 2 superpowers, was quite clear. And despite the fact that they were allies and there was this allied goodwill that stayed on until the very late stages of the war, and I can give you many examples of that, despite that goodwill, there was clearly competition, and the American president, who himself had become president in April 1945, who was actually quite nervous initially, who was relatively inexperienced, and he had to deal with people like Churchill and Stalin, the old hands in international politics. Despite that goodwill, there was clear consideration on the American part, and also, of course, on Stalin's part, to prevent conceding any more ground to the Americans. I think on Churchill's side, if you compare Churchill and Truman, it's remarkable because it's probably counterintuitive, but Churchill was harder with Stalin than Truman. Churchill, for example, wouldn't want the Soviet Union to play any part in the war against Japan if they could avoid that. And Stalin really tried to get into war with Japan because that would mean securing some of the interests, some of the territorial interests that had been promised to the Soviet Union at the Yalta Conference in February. So again, to go back to my answer, the use of the bomb wasn't simply, if I can put it that way, wasn't simply against Japan. It was also partly against the Soviet Union that the bomb was used. And that's how Stalin actually took it. When he got news, he became quite depressed in the sense that he knew that this was partly also to intimidate the Soviet Union in the coming Cold War confrontation. So there are other considerations which I can't mention for in the interest of time, but it was a very complex decision that while they knew that it wasn't strictly necessary, already in the week that the order was given to use the bomb, the American military leadership, including the president also, they knew that the bomb wasn't strictly necessary to win in the war against Japan, but they still decided to use it despite the moral and other considerations.
Yeah, I mean, and Japan surrendered almost immediately after after the second bomb was dropped. So it did put an end to that war. But
can I come back to that on that question if we have time? Because this is an important point to be made that the bombs actually, especially the American viewpoint, that the bombs actually did put an end to the war, that they forced Japan to surrender. But once again, it wasn't so simple. So, for example, on the day after the Hiroshima bomb was dropped, because communications were really damaged in the bombing itself, the news came to Tokyo only in the evening, and the meeting of the emperor's meeting with all the ministers happened on the 7th of August. But the minutes of the meeting actually don't demonstrate any change in Japan's course. So if you believe that the bomb really scared the Japanese so badly that they suddenly decided to surrender after Hiroshima, no, you would be disappointed, because the Japanese, while the emperor actually understood that this was a different weapon, that this weapon was a lot more devastating than anything that they had seen by that time, it didn't change Japan's determination, so to say, or reluctance to surrender. Determination to go on or reluctance. It was more reluctance to surrender, more kind of confusion. It was a confusing time. But when just hours before Nagasaki bomb was dropped on the 9th, Soviet troops crossed into the puppet kingdom of Manchukuo, that became a lot more decisive factor in the Japanese decision to surrender, because, and this is a very interesting coincidence, even experienced politicians like Stalin could not have planned it better. It was a coincidence. So when the Potsdam Declaration is announced on July 26, 1945, Soviet Union does not sign it. Despite the fact that Potsdam Declaration, by definition, it's a conference that is happening in Potsdam. It is organized by Stalin. It's in Germany, but it's hosted by Stalin. It's a big allied conference. Soviet Union does not join it for other reasons, for reasons that it hadn't been sufficiently consulted, that they weren't ready. But because they don't join in the signing, only China, the UK, and the US sign it at the time, the Japanese, who had all along had hoped to use the Soviet Union, with which they had a neutrality pact, to use the Soviet officers in negotiating better terms with the Allies, because the Soviets were kind of neutral with Japan, but on the Allied side, so the Soviet Union and Japan were not at war at the time, and because the Soviets didn't join the Potsdam Declaration, that kept alive Japanese hopes that the Soviets will come in. And Stalin intentionally kept it that way because he knew that the Japanese would be completely unprepared. And when the Soviets come in and they storm the puppet kingdom of Manchukuo in a matter of days, they completely outgun and outnumber this vaunted Kwantung army that was there to defend Japanese interests. That is when the last hope of any better terms actually die for the Japanese, because now that the Soviet Union has entered the war, on top of the atomic bombings, that's when the final decision is taken. So I wouldn't really say that it was the bombs that ended the war. It was a combination of factors.
That's super interesting, because there's certainly I guess it's been kind of, the impact of the bomb drop then has been slightly mythicized in that we kind of understand it as America dropped the bomb and then Japan surrendered, but clearly there's a lot more going on there that contributed to that. That's really fascinating. And in the interest of time, as we sort of start to wrap up this conversation, I'm really keen to look at how the atomic bomb drop really shaped the future of international relations, because we see today programs like Trident in the UK and other sort of nuclear deterrent programs around the world that have been put in place specifically to prevent the use of nuclear weapons. Organizations like NATO. How much did the atomic bomb drop really kind of shape the way we kind of operate now?
Enormously. The Hiroshima bombing is a horrible event that actually was the first instance in which atomic bombs are used against civilians. But unfortunately, it wasn't the last. It created this consciousness among primarily initially the Japanese civil society groups, starting with the core of the hibakusha, as in Japanese, hibakusha means atomic bomb victims. And of course, that created this awareness that this kind of weapon the damage that kind of a weapon can do. But on the other hand, from the international politics viewpoint, again, if you look at it from the international relations theory viewpoint, scholars like Kenneth Waltz in 1981 actually wrote a paper that claimed that atomic bombs actually made the world a more secure place. And there is some truth to that. So despite the growing power of the atomic bombs to wreak devastation, of course you have the hydrogen bomb and other bombs, other weapons, and of course not just the weapons but means of delivery. The Trident is one of them. Of course ICBMs are other. And despite all of that technology goes hand in hand with the consciousness of MAD, mutually assured destruction that would happen had any of the powers used a weapon against the other. And of course we have brilliant films. I think the one that I could highlight is Stanley Kubrick's Dr. Strangelove, which kind of in a comic way shows how close the world could come to nuclear devastation. Oppenheimer is another brilliant film which I thoroughly enjoyed, especially the part that anyone who hasn't seen, I don't want to spoil it too much, but it's not really about the bomb. It's more about the man. But it's a really important, once again, kind of warning to the catastrophe that you and I weren't born then. But the world kind of came very close and avoided and managed to avoid. And it is a warning in the sense that even in the Ukraine war that you just mentioned, Russia is mentioning the fact that nuclear weapons are on the table for Russia, which is absolutely horrifying. So what is the legacy of Hiroshima and Nagasaki? The legacy is very complex and very difficult. But it's not only negative. Yes, it was horrible that Japan became the first nation to suffer from nuclear weapons, and thankfully it has stayed that way. And let's hope that it stays that way. And because of that experience, also one other incident that needs to be mentioned: in 1954, there was the so-called Lucky Dragon incident. Those who are interested can look it up, in which in a very strange kind of irony, or not even irony, I guess it in the continuation of the tragedy, the crew of a fishing boat called Lucky Dragon Number 5 was caught in the fallout of a American nuclear test in the Pacific near the Bikini Atoll, which led to some more people dying. And unfortunately, the Hiroshima and Nagasaki victims were not the last to die from nuclear fallouts. However, once again, that raised a lot of awareness and a lot of pushback from various people, from the civil society. So the legacy of the weapons isn't only negative in the sense that by demonstrating the horrors and sometimes quite literally demonstrating the horrors, because photographers took pictures of melted bottles, but also of people, of the wounds, of the burns. The famous photograph of the shadow on the steps of a government building in Hiroshima of a person who was disappeared in one sentence, who was in 1 second, who was. So all of that horror actually also created this widespread awareness and the peace, anti-nuclear and peace movement around the world, which I hope to think played a part in keeping the world a peaceful place, that prevented in a way, or kind of made very obvious the madness of the Third World War, which would be the war of annihilation for everybody.
Yeah, of course. And I guess if there is any sort of silver lining to this, then that is it. Then of course, the bomb drop itself, the devastation that it caused and the impact it had just cannot really be overstated at all. And I think the relevance that it has today in terms of the genuine worry there is around the world with what's happening with Russia and the rhetoric being used around nuclear weapons. I think we should all look back on this and listen to this podcast as well, because we don't want it to happen again. And there's reasons why everything has happened since to prevent that. But I think we have to bring this discussion to a close. I think there's so much more that we could unpack that we touched on in this episode about sort of Japanese-American relations. So I think I'm going to have to get you back on the podcast sometime, Sherzod, to talk to me about that.
Absolutely.
And for anyone listening who might want to connect with you or find out a bit more about what you do, how can they do that?
They can find me on Twitter. And if there are any potential students interested in studying this and many other things, please consider applying to the UEA. And let me also use this opportunity to plug the podcast that I record with a colleague here at the UEA, with Ra Mason. And the podcast is called The East Angle, and it's a podcast of two academics trying to speak in non-academic way about the East, broadly defined. So with a specific focus on Japan, but of course East Asia and the East, including, of course, the former Soviet Union. So please search for The East Angle wherever you get your podcasts. We've only recorded 2 episodes.
We'll definitely put a link to that in the show notes for anyone that wants to explore further. And of course, if you've enjoyed this podcast, I'd really appreciate it if you could leave us a rating and a review wherever you're listening to this, and give us a follow as well, because then all future episodes will appear in your feed. Thank you so much for listening. And if you want to support the show, you can head over to Patreon right now, where there'll also be a little bit of a bonus feature from this episode to enjoy as well. Thanks very much, and goodbye.